Good evening. I'd like to welcome you to the Dunham Bible Museum Lecture Series. That is our second lecture this year. If you missed the first one, it will soon be on the internet for you to listen to. This was Dr. Ryrie speaking on some aspects of the history of the English Bible. And one of the aims of our Dunham Bible Museum and its lecture series and programs is to show the Bible's impact and influence in every single area of life. The Bible is, of course, the sacred book to millions of Christians, but it is undoubtedly the most important book in all of Western civilization as well. And we are very privileged to have with us this evening one man who can tell us probably more about the Bible's influence in literature than any other person, certainly more about the Bible's influence in Shakespeare's writings. Dr. Naseeb Shaheen is professor of English at the University of Memphis and a gentleman who is recognized as the foremost living authority on biblical references in English literature. He was born in Chicago, but has maintained very close ties with his ancestral background in Ramallah in Palestine. He did his undergraduate work at the American University of Beirut, his PhD from UCLA, with his dissertation topic on a theme that he's carried through in his career on the biblical references in Spenser's Faerie Queene, and he has published a book on that subject. He is internationally known and recognized as an authority on Shakespeare, having published 5 books on Shakespeare and Spenser. His most recent volume is The Biblical References in Shakespeare's Plays. This is an 800-page book that covers everything that Shakespeare said. Sir? 880-page book that covers every reference that Shakespeare had to the Bible or allusions. During his 23 years of very intense scholarship and study on the Bible and Shakespeare, Dr. Shaheen has collected a large collection of Geneva Bibles as well as rare texts that were contemporary and known to Shakespeare, and he has used in writing his plays. So we're very grateful to have Dr. Shaheen to share his biblical and his literary scholarship with us. Dr. Shaheen.
Well, after that introduction, I had better live up to expectations. But I'm very happy to be here. And the title of the lecture tonight, of course, as you know, is Biblical References in Shakespeare. And that's the title of my book also, Biblical References in Shakespeare's Plays. And I worked 23 years on that book, day and night. But I would like to tell you that that book has now become the most quoted Shakespeare book in print, even though there are thousands and tens of thousands of Shakespeare books. And the reason why, it's mainly because it's a reference book, but also because there are two universities, 3 publishers that are putting Shakespeare's plays out with a great deal of commentary, each play to a single volume with a great deal of commentary. Those are Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and the Arden edition. Well, for example, in the Cambridge edition of King Lear, my book is referred to 23 times. It'll have a certain line in King Lear, and then the footnote will say, Shaheen says that this passage is based on Isaiah 24:20, for example, which it will then quote. That's all. But that happens 23 times in the Cambridge edition of King Lear. And the same thing goes, for example, in Antony and Cleopatra. In the Cambridge edition of Antony and Cleopatra, my book is quoted 13 times. So I was very happy to see this, and it makes it feel that all the effort you put into the book was worthwhile. I might say that you probably know that the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. is the greatest Shakespeare library of any university or library in the world, even greater than the British Library in Shakespeare. You see now, for example, they have 79 copies of the first folio of Shakespeare. 7 years after Shakespeare died, he died 1616, and 7 years later, in 1623, two fellow actors said, it's a shame that this man's works should not be collected and published in one volume, and they put out the first folio. It was a big job. It took 2 years just to get it ready and to do the printing of it. Well, now, the reason that the Folger Library has 69 copies, while the British Library has only 6, is no two first folios are the same. Why? Because of the printing habits of that time. They would run a signature. You know what a signature is, a quire, Q-U-I-R-E, a certain section, usually of 32 pages. They would start printing one of those signatures, and then they'd pull one of the sheets out in order to make corrections, typesetter corrections. But they would not stop the press. The press would keep printing those pages, those 32 pages, even though they had not been corrected. When the corrections have been made, they stop the press and make the corrections and then go on. But those signatures that were misprinted, that had mistakes in them, were not thrown away. They were bound in one of the volumes. So, and that happened with every signature, every quire, Q-U-I-R-E, in the book. So, for example, one edition of Shakespeare's folio would have the first signature corrected, the second corrected, the third not corrected, the fourth not, the fifth corrected, the sixth, and so forth. And what you want to do is see how many first folios you can get, so you can get at all of the corrected signatures. And that is what they have. Well, the reason I'm bringing this up is that Dr. Barbara Mowat is the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. And someone interviewed her, and this was published in the Shakespeare newsletter. And they asked her, what books do you consider indispensable for the Folger Shakespeare Library? Folger, probably because a person who's related to the Folger Coffee Company built that building. And she says, well, we have the Geneva Bible, we have Ovid's Metamorphoses, and we have Naseeb Shaheen's biblical references in Shakespeare's tragedies. And since Shaheen shows that most of Shakespeare's biblical references were made to the Geneva Bible, we always have to have a Geneva Bible at hand. And so I thought that was very flattering. I do not know Barbara Mowat. I had never met her. But when I saw that, I was very pleased that all of that work after 23 years was worthwhile. They also have the largest collection of Shakespeare Cortos. What is a quarto? Here, for example, is a reproduction of the second quarto of Hamlet, 1604. Here's what you mean by a quarto. If you take a page and fold it once, that's a folio. That one sheet becomes 4 pages, 1, 2, 3, 4. If you take it and fold it a second time, that's a quarto. That one sheet of paper becomes 8 pages, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you fold it again, it becomes an octavo. And you see, you could begin with any size sheet you wanted. It could be, the sheet could be 4 feet by 6 feet. And you can even fold it again after an octavo. And Shakespeare's, only half of Shakespeare's plays, 18 out of the 36 plays that appeared in the first folio, were published in quarto. So when the first folio came out, they may have preserved 18 of Shakespeare's plays that had never been printed or would have been printed much later and in not very good states. But here the first folio was put together by 2 fellow actors of Shakespeare. And so a volume like this in Shakespeare's time, here actually is a title page, the gray, was nothing but as cheap. It's been trimmed, but that's how it looks, the title page of the quarto. The Folger Shakespeare Library has the largest collections in the world of quartos of original Shakespeare plays. And so in Shakespeare, the Folger Shakespeare Library is the greatest library there is in the world. And they have, I'm trying to interest them in my Bible collection, but we'll see if we're successful or not. But anyway, the reason these references, of course, the biblical references in Shakespeare, are not to the King James Bible. The King James Bible came out in 1611, and Shakespeare wrote his last play, The Tempest, in 1612. So obviously, the vast majority of plays were written, except one, when there was no King James Bible. He even seems to have written The Tempest from after he retired and went to Stratford. Why? Because The Tempest has the most extensive stage directions in it. Because he's not going to be there to tell them how to direct it, to tell them how it should be performed. And so it has very copious stage directions. Okay, now the question arises, why does Shakespeare refer so often to the Bible? Because he was religious? The answer seems to be no. He does not at all seem to be very religious. And there is no religious message in Shakespeare's plays, in spite of a play having 50 or 60 biblical references. There's no religious message. In fact, I've written a couple articles about this. People did not go to the theater in order to hear a sermon. You went to church to hear a sermon. People went to the theater to be entertained. Shakespeare simply, as part of his style, decided to take a lot of phrases from the Bible, especially the Geneva Bible, but also from other Bibles, as we're going to see, and incorporate them into his plays. There are those, for example, who insist that there is a Christian message, a religious message in Shakespeare's plays. These people are pejoratively called the Christianizers of Shakespeare. There are not many of them, but they're very vocal, and they're not really in very good repute. I would like to give you some examples from Shakespeare's plays which really sound that these are definitely religious, Christian belief, and which they say, you see, Shakespeare was a believing Christian. In Richard III, when Richard sends the murderers down into the dungeon to murder Clarence, Clarence is the brother of the king, but he's older than Richard, and he had the right to the throne before Richard III would have it. They come to murder him. Richard had told him, don't speak with him. He's very articulate. Don't speak with him. Just kill him before he even wakes up. But they do speak with him, and when he knows he's going to kill them, listen to what he says. I charge you, as you hope to have redemption by Christ's dear blood shed for our grievous sins, that you depart and lay no hand on me. The deed you undertake is damnable. You see, now people will say, see, Shakespeare believes in the ransom. How clear can it get? That's an exact quote. I charge you, as you hope to have redemption by Christ's dear blood shed for our grievous sins, that you depart and lay no hand on me. The deed you undertake is damnable. You see, in a religious age, anybody would say, be careful what you do. He was the king's brother. God is watching you. But here he said more than God is watching you, and you're going to have to account for your murder. He made that statement. Now here's another statement that makes people think that Shakespeare has a religious message in his plays. In King Lear, this is very obvious. Cordelia says she's the good daughter, unlike the two other daughters, Regan and Goneril, who threw their father out. Cordelia says, oh, dear father, it is thy business that I go about. You see, that's obvious. Jesus at the temple saying, why did you have to go looking for me for 3 days? Did you not know I must be about my Father's business? So they say, can't you see? Cordelia there is a Christ figure. And so they claim that Shakespeare is definitely a religious poet. Now, let me tell you another one from King Lear. I'd like the audience to see if you can interpret this. How Shakespeare can do this is absolutely amazing. Someone tells Lear when he expresses huge disappointment at his vicious two daughters, to whom he gave everything, to whom he loved, and yet they turned against him. Someone says about Cordelia, thou hast one daughter who redeems nature from the general curse which twain have brought her to. Let me read that again. Thou hast one daughter who redeems nature from the general curse which twain have brought her to. The one daughter, of course, would be Cordelia. It is thy business that I go about. Who redeems nature, a very Christian word, Christ's redemption, from the general curse which twain have brought her to. Who are the twain? Adam and Eve, exactly. And you see, it's unbelievable what Shakespeare does in his plays. But you have other scriptures that are so godless, you would not think that the same person wrote them. For example, in Macbeth, Macbeth says about life, it is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Would a person who's a believing Christian say something like that? In King Lear, after Gloucester has been blinded so mercilessly, he says, you could not use the word God on the stage. If you did, you have to say gods, but it meant God. Now, Gloucester says, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods, meaning to God. They kill us for their sport. In other words, as little boys go around, I can kill more flies than you can, and they have a competition. As flies to wanton boys means mischievous boys. As flies to mischievous boys, to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. God kills us for his sport. And you can find many statements like that throughout Shakespeare's plays, which set against the words of Clarence and Cordelia, would show that he probably was not very religious at all. One more ungodly statement. In Titus Andronicus, the statement occurs, oh, why should nature frame so foul a den, unless the gods delight in tragedy? Meaning unless God delights in tragedy. That's after what happens to Lavinia in the play, when her arms are cut off, her tongue is cut out, and they try to do everything to prevent her from revealing who committed a certain murder. Okay, so you have plenty of biblical references in Shakespeare's plays, but there's no religious message behind them. Here are some of the other examples of biblical references in Shakespeare's plays. You take Romeo and Juliet. Friar Lawrence is out very early in the morning when it's still dark, and he's picking flower petals. Those are the flower petals he squeezes in order to make the juice, the potion, that he gives to Juliet when Juliet is put to sleep for 42 hours. So Shakespeare wants to have Friar Lawrence describe the retreat of night with the onset of dawn. What does Friar Lawrence say? Darkness like a drunkard reels as dawn approaches. Darkness like a drunkard reels. Now you can ask anyone, that's a biblical reference. You can ask any clergyman or a bishop in the Anglican Church, where in the Bible is that from? And they probably offhand could not tell you. Does anyone in the audience think they know where it's from? Darkness like a drunkard reels? No comments. Okay, in Isaiah 24:20 it says, when the Lord comes to judge the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard. Darkness like a drunkard reels. The earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard. That's not an accidental verbal similarity. There are too many words that are common to both of them, and this occurs throughout Shakespeare. Okay, in Hamlet, the ghost of Hamlet's father appears to him on top of the castle in Denmark, Elsinore, and the ghost starts telling Hamlet, follow me, follow me. He wants to tell him actually how he is murdered, but his friends, Horatio and the others who are with him, don't go. That ghost may be a devil. He may be trying to get you to commit suicide by jumping off the tower. And Hamlet says, let go of me. I'm going to follow the ghost, though hell hell itself should gape. A biblical reference. Where is that taken from? It's taken from the Geneva Bible, the Bishop's Bible here. The Bishop's Bible of Isaiah 5:14, which says, therefore gapeth hell. It's not from the Geneva. What does the Geneva say at Isaiah 5:14? It says, hell hath enlarged itself. So here's a case that one evidence that Shakespeare was acquainted not only with the Geneva Bible, which had the widest circulation of any Protestant Bible at the time, but also with the Bishop's Bible. Now here's really one to show you Shakespeare's skill in using Scripture. This is from The Winter's Tale. Autolycus, who's a servant, finds himself dressed up like an aristocrat, and he goes around trying to throw his weight around and to accuse people and make them cringe before him. So he comes upon certain people and he accuses them, and the clown in the play says, we are but plain fellows, sir. Autolycus says, a lie, you are rough and hairy. We are but plain fellows, sir. And this fellow who's trying to tyrannize says, a lie, you are rough and hairy. Can anyone tell me where in the Bible that's from? Louder? I can't hear him. Yes, thank you. It's from the Genesis account of the birth of Esau and Jacob. You see, I can't see the people in the back here at all because the lights are shining in my face. So I can only see the people in the first 3 or 4 rows. Very good, thank you. You see, that's based on the Genesis account of the birth of the twins, Esau and Jacob. Here's how the account says in Genesis 25, 25, and 27. So he that came out first was red, and he was all over as a rough garment. The Bishop's there says a hairy garment. And they called his name Esau. And the boys grew up. Esau was a cunning hunter, but Jacob was a plain man. Can you imagine Shakespeare taking that passage and making it, we are plain fellows, sir. But Jacob was a plain man. And Autolycus, a lie, you are rough and hairy. But here Shakespeare is acquainted with both the Geneva and the Bishop's Bible because only the Bishop's Bible has a hairy garment. He that came out first was all over as a rough garment. The Bishop says a hairy garment. And Shakespeare says, you are rough and hairy. And he had said, we are just plain men. They grew up. Esau was a cunning hunter, but Jacob was a plain man. It's unbelievable how Shakespeare how well he knew the Bible and how he can adapt them to the people in his plays. And so I have here, for example, here's what took so long on that book. I mentioned how plain, rough, and hairy in the above passage indicates that Shakespeare was acquainted with more than one version of this account. And I give the readings of all of the Bibles, English Bibles up till that day. I did that for every single reference in the book, and there are thousands of them. I looked it up in Tyndale, Matthew, Taverner. Those three have rough all over as it was an hide, a simple man. Coverdale has all rough as an hide, a simple man. The Great Bible has was all over as it were a rough garment, a perfect man, and so forth. So this is actually what took so long, and you have to be a perfectionist, but you don't have to be a perfectionist, but I try to do a thorough job. Now, what use is all of this, somebody might ask? It's not just interesting, but to scholars it's very important. What were Shakespeare's sources, the building materials? For example, you tell someone, I just bought a home. Well, what is your home? Is it brick? Is it frame? Is it stucco? You see, you want to know something. How are Shakespeare's plays put together? What is one of the ingredients in them? And the biblical references is one of them. For example, the account that Shakespeare refers to most often is the prodigal son of Luke 15. that reference to the prodigal son occurs more often in Shakespeare's plays than any other passage in Scripture. The second most common is probably the reference to Cain and Abel, and so forth. For example, when Claudius in Hamlet is praying, he's the one who has just murdered his brother, married his the elder Hamlet, married his brother's wife 2 months later. And now he's taken the kingship away from Hamlet, who should have gotten it, but he's wearing the crown. And so he's praying, and he can't pray. He knows God is not listening to a murderer like him. Here's what he says. My offense is rank. It hath the primal eldest curse on it, a brother's murder. The primal eldest curse is the curse on Cain. My offense is rank. It hath the primal eldest curse on it, a brother's murder. Here, look at this now. Hamlet is scolding his mother in her bedroom, his mother's chamber. 2 months! 2 months. You couldn't even wait longer to marry your brother-in-law? And she is wearing a locket around her neck with her present husband's picture in it, Claudius. Hamlet is wearing a locket around his neck with the elder Hamlet, his father's picture in it. And he tells his mother, you exchange this for this, and look how Shakespeare says it. Here is your husband like a mildewed ear blasting his wholesome brother. Where's that taken from? Someone in the back who spoke up. Here is your husband like a mildewed ear blasting his wholesome brother. That's Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream. Thank you. You see, the 7 ears of corn that were blasted with the east wind. It is absolutely unbelievable how Shakespeare weaves Scripture into his plays. You see, the reason why Shakespeare is studied so carefully is he is generally considered the greatest writer who ever lived in any language. Even greater than the Bible. You don't make those comparisons. We're talking about secular literature. He's considered the greatest writer who ever lived. Why? I know when I teach Shakespeare at the university, I tell them, why is Shakespeare so great? It can be summed up by saying he touches every shore of human experience. Do you know what that means? I ask my students. He touches every shore of human experience. There is no thought or feeling or emotion or experience that will pass through your mind. Love, hate, spite, empathy, sympathy, kindness, that will pass through your mind or the mind of anyone alive or who has ever lived. They estimate that 20 billion people have lived from the beginning of mankind. There are about 6 billion living now. There's no thought that has ever passed through the mind of anyone who has ever lived that's not somewhere in Shakespeare. Shakespeare's accomplishment is so great, it's unbelievable and frightening. How can that possibly be? You can take Dickens' novels. Dickens' novels would fill a shelf of books that wide. But you cannot say about Dickens, he touches every shore of human experience. You can't say that about anyone except Shakespeare. Another reason why he's great is he says everything worthwhile on every subject. Absolutely universal. He touches every shore of human experience. He has said everything worthwhile on every subject. In fact, in those 37 plays that he wrote, 36 came out in the first folio. They couldn't get the copyright for one of them. You have about 30, 40 characters in each play. If you knew those plays well, there's no kind of a type of a personality you will ever meet in your life that's not somewhere in one of Shakespeare's plays. Oh no, there won't be somebody named Steve Osborne, just to make up a name. No, but somebody with the personality of Steve Osborne that you're talking about will be somewhere in Shakespeare's plays. I'll give you another example of how Shakespeare is great. John Donne, who was made the Dean of St. Paul and who was a great poet in his own right, says one time, I get up early in the morning and I get on my knees at 4 o'clock in the morning in order to pray to God and to thank him for all of his blessings. And I hear a cart out in the cartwheel out in the street. And my mind begins wandering. Who is this that's up already at 4 o'clock in the morning in the dark in the street? Here I am speaking to the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, the creator of the universe, and something like a cartwheel makes my mind wander. And there's a whole sermon on that. Don's sermons have been published. You can buy them. And he gave a 1-hour sermon on that subject. Why does my mind wander when I'm praying? Well, Shakespeare said it better in 2 lines. When Claudius tries to pray and he says, my offense is rank and God is not listening, here's what he says. My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. There's not a poet alive today in any language who can write 2 lines like that. If you know of anyone, let me know who he is. My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. Words without thoughts never to heaven go. Moreover, those lines are iambic. Tatam, tatam, you know, an iamb is a syllable, is a foot, where you have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed. You have 5 of those. Tatam, 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 tatam. That's the basic structure of English poetry, iambic pentameter. My words fly up, my thoughts remain below. It's iambic. Then he varies the second line. If you had every line iambic pentameter, it would be monotonous and sleep-inducing. Then he has words without thoughts. That's not iambic, but it's a good variation. Near to heaven go. The last half of that is iambic. And so that shows you Shakespeare's head and shoulders above everybody else who ever lived. He is so great, that's why people say Shakespeare couldn't have written those plays. It must have been someone who went to the university. No, not at all. Not at all. Nobody says that Ben Jonson, his contemporary, who wrote a lot of plays, the Volpone and The Alchemist and many others, he never went to the university. And nobody says about him that he didn't write those plays. You know, a lot of study in a university sometimes smothers creative activity. And so it was Shakespeare who definitely wrote those plays. We know what Shakespeare studied in every form, meaning in every grade in the grammar school that he went to. I would like to tell you, for those who say that Shakespeare was not very educated, you know why grammar schools are called grammar schools? Because they taught them Latin grammar. Languages like French, German, French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, that are all descended from the original Latin, and English are all dialects. These dialects in time are going to die out. If you really want to carve in marble rather than write in sand, you have to learn Latin grammar. And so Shakespeare was drilled from the age of 6 to 16 with Latin grammar. I can tell you that Shakespeare knew Latin better than anyone who graduates from a university today. When I'm in Memphis, I say that about the University of Memphis. He had much better knowledge of Latin than anyone who graduates from the University of Memphis with a BS degree in the classics, without any doubt. And so that's no excuse to say Shakespeare couldn't have written those plays because he was not educated. And the person who was the schoolmaster in Stratford, you can still go see the same schoolroom that Shakespeare studied in. He had an MA degree, and that was the highest degree you could get at that time. So Shakespeare was well educated. Now look, the list of references in my book from Genesis to Revelation, to show you how many references there are, run from page 769 to 826, 58 pages. And that includes the Apocrypha. I have here, just to show you, 4 pages of the appendix of that book, that 880-page book. Here, for example, are all the references from Luke. You see, these are all. This is the passage in Luke, 6:19, 6:20 and 24, 6:23, 6:26, 6:27. And these are all the plays where they occur. And so here, for example, are the references to the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha was part of the King James Bible in Shakespeare's day. The Apocrypha, as you know, has a book called Ecclesiasticus. Not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. Shakespeare knew that so well. Here's the beginning of all of the biblical references in Ecclesiasticus. Now, these represent only 4 pages out of the appendix, while the appendix actually has in it 58 pages like this. So you can imagine how many biblical references are in Shakespeare's plays. Okay. But do you know what the Apocrypha is? The Hebrew Masoretic text is what we have today, say, in the Old Testament of the King James Bible. The rabbis in Jerusalem were conservative, and they didn't want anything else. But in Alexandria, Egypt, you had Jews who were Hellenized. They could no longer read Hebrew, so the Bible had to be translated for them into Greek, and that's the Septuagint version, because according to myth, it was translated by 70 men, and some myths say in 70 days, and so forth. But anyway, they were very liberal, and they introduced into the Old Testament books like Ecclesiasticus, like Tobit, and several others, and they were interspersed throughout the Old Testament. And that's the way they are today in Catholic Bibles, even English Catholic Bibles. In 1535, Coverdale took all of those books out of the Old Testament and put them together between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Thus, in Geneva Bibles, you have, in the table of contents, the Old Testament, the Apocrypha, the New Testament. And you see, there are several good books in there. 1st and 2nd Maccabees are very good historically. Ecclesiasticus is very good, but some of the others are very melodramatic. The stories are melodramatic means. You know what melodrama means in literature? It's the slang word is corny. You tell a joke and it's not funny. They'll tell you, oh, it's corny. The definition, the literary definition of melodrama is it tries to elicit from you, E-L-I-C-I-T. It tries to elicit from you, draw out from you an emotion of which it's not worthy. And that's how many of the books in the Apocrypha are. But Ecclesiasticus, very great book. 1st and 2nd Maccabees, very good history. So the Apocrypha was part, when the King James Bible came out in 1611, it had the Apocrypha between the Old and the New Testament, although we today may not like that it was part of what we consider to be the Word of God. And so he knew it very well. But remember now, this is Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes. You know, I jokingly tell people when we discuss Shakespeare's knowledge of the Bible that Shakespeare's knowledge of the Bible was so immense, he could put the Archbishop of Canterbury to shame. And you can sort of see that from what we've said thus far. Plays like Hamlet and Othello each have between 50 and 60 conscious biblical references. Other plays don't have that many. Now, these are not simply accidental verbal similarities. These are not simply similar situations, but they're actually phrases, words taken out of the Bible, the Geneva, the Bishops, or some other Bible, and used in his plays. Like, for example, darkness like a drunkard reels. The earth reels to and fro like a drunkard. Okay, well now, there's another point to discuss. Just as there are the Christianizers of Shakespeare who try and tell you that Shakespeare's plays have a religious message in them, we also have those scholars, Catholic scholars, who say that Shakespeare was a closet Catholic. He was a secret Catholic, and he owned a Reims New Testament. And so we want to ask, did Shakespeare own a Catholic Bible? The Reims New Testament came out in 1582. The Old Testament came out in 2 volumes in 1609 and 1610 when the seminary had moved back to Douay. Now, the Catholic Church did not want the Bible translated into the common language. They said that the laity, the people who read the Catholic Bible, read the Bible in their own language, will be led astray, and they'll give it all sorts of strange interpretations. But it's necessary to translate it into English because so that the faithful reader might not be misled by the translations of the heretics, meaning the Geneva Bible and the Anglican Church and so forth. They exchanged barbs against each other at that time all the time. Moreover, when they translated the Bible into the Reims version, they translated it not from the literal Greek of the New Testament or the Hebrew of the Old Testament, but they translated it from the Latin Vulgate of Jerome. Why? Because the Council of Trent, which met for several years in the 1540s and 1540s, said that the Latin Vulgate is, quote, the authentical version, end quote, and then elsewhere it said to be refused of none. And so the Reims New Testament was translated from the Latin. In other words, it's a translation of a translation. It's 2 steps away from the original language, not just one. They knew that that was a weakness, and a great part of the introduction, the preface of the Reims New Testament, tries to justify why is it that they used the Latin version rather than the Greek. And they used all sorts of arguments in order to justify it. But the thing is, I'd like to say this, though. William Allen, who got permission from the Pope to translate the Bible into English, was very proficient in Greek and Hebrew. It's not that they didn't know Hebrew. He was very proficient in Greek and Hebrew, and he could have translated from the original. He probably consulted it, but he mainly followed the Vulgate. The result, though, was a Bible translation that's very, very Latinate. For example, in the Lord's Prayer, it says, "Give us today our supersubstantial bread." Well, that sounds strange, but at least it's understandable. Give us bread more than enough, supersubstantial. But there are other phrases in the original Latin Bible, in the original Reims New Testament, that absolutely you cannot understand unless you knew Latin. Let me read to you 2 examples. Here is how Hebrews 13:16 reads in the 1582 edition of the Reims New Testament. "Beneficence and communication do not forget, for with such hosts God is promerited." What does that mean? Latinate vocabulary. Beneficence and communication do not forget, for with such hosts God is promerited. Here's how it reads in the King James Bible, which some people say now is a little bit old and out of date, but at least it's understandable. Hebrews 13:16 in the King James Bible, quoting from the 1611 edition, "But to do good and to communicate forget not, for with such sacrifices God is well pleased." You see, it's very understandable. But I'll tell you, I like the Revised Standard Version very much. When it first came out in the 1950s, I bought one, and here's how it appears, Hebrews 13:16 in the Revised Standard Version. "Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God." You can't beat that for understandability. In contrast with the way it's translated in the Reims New Testament. Here's one that's even more puzzling. Here's how Romans 9:28 reads in the 1582 Reims New Testament. "For consummating a word and abridging it in equity, because a word abridged shall our Lord make upon the earth." You see, that's incomprehensible. For consummating a word and abridging it in equity, because a word abridged shall our Lord make upon the earth. Impossible. Okay, here's how it reads in the King James, 16:11. For he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because a short work will the Lord make upon the earth. Okay, much more understandable. Okay, let me tell you how it reads in the Revised Standard Version. For the Lord will execute his judgment upon the earth with rigor and dispatch. Now that is really understandable. But anyway, the Reims in later years was revised in order to make it more understandable. But they tried to defend such literalness by saying, we don't like to be like the heretics, the Protestants, who take impudent boldness with translating the Word of God. They translate the Word of God as carelessly as they translate Livy or some pagan work. And we don't want to be like them who use presumptuous boldness and liberties in translating. But the truth of the matter is that they often followed the Geneva Bible and borrowed from it, even though they attacked it and tried to say that their translation was much better. Now, the question then comes up, did Shakespeare own a Reims New Testament? A few Catholic scholars say so. I'll tell you who's the outstanding person defending Shakespeare's Catholic background. It's a Jesuit priest named Peter Milward, who's a professor of Shakespeare at Sophia University in Tokyo. Peter Milward. He's published several books. One of them was Shakespeare's Religious Background, which I reviewed. He says, for example, not only that Shakespeare was a secret Catholic, a closet Catholic, but who, quote, living in cruel and dangerous times, end quote, could not openly show his Catholicism. Living in cruel and dangerous times. Okay. However, most scholars don't agree with him. Even many scholars, professors at Notre Dame, they'll say that he's way off the beam. And, but Milward even says that the secret message of the last 4 plays, called the Romances, if you read them carefully, the secret message in those last 4 plays is that Shakespeare is hoping that the Church of England and the Church of Rome will be reunited under the Pope. You see, now look, people didn't go to the playhouse to have a religious message like that. And Peter Milward has a fine mind. The way he can pick out little words here and there and put them together to try and prove his point. But obviously, it's really wasted scholarship. But I'll tell you how the Reims really was circulated in Shakespeare's day. Not by itself, but William Fulke, F-U-L-K-E, who was the master of Pembroke College in Oxford. You still have Pembroke College in Oxford. It's directly across the street from the entrance to Christ Church Cathedral. He made it a point to leave no Catholic work of controversy unanswered. I'm going to answer every Catholic work that comes off their printing press in the continent, in Reims or Douay or wherever it might be. So what did he do? He published what's called the Refutation. He has the Bishop's Bible. Of course, he's an Anglican, so he would use the Bishop's Bible of the Anglican Church. He has the Bishop's Bible in one column, the Reims Bible, New Testament in another column, printed carefully and accurately, and then all of his commentary at the bottom showing why the Bishop's Bible is a much better translation and much more accurate than the Reims New Testament. But that is how the Reims New Testament got its greatest circulation in England. If you had a Reims New Testament by itself, you were suspect. The first edition came out in 1589, the second edition in 1601. I have 2 or 3 of those editions. But Fulke's Refutation is the way that Shakespeare's works, is the way that the Reims New Testament became widely circulated, if anyone was interested. Now, I'd like to tell you what is the outstanding example they used to say that Shakespeare had a Reims New Testament and he was a secret Catholic. They only have one good example. Okay. In Coriolanus, Act 3, Scene 1, line 70, we have this. Coriolanus is saying that if you let this rebellion go on, you're going to be in trouble. So he says in Act 3, Scene 1, it's the word cockle. When you come across the word cockle, that's what is the key word. We nourish against our Senate the cockle of rebellion, insolence, and sedition, which we ourselves have plowed for, sowed, and scattered by mingling them with us. We nourish against our Senate the cockle of rebellion, insolence, sedition. Now, in Jesus' parables of the kingdom of heaven, 5 or 6 of them in Matthew chapter 13, when he says the kingdom of heaven is like a man who found treasure in a field, he sold everything he had and bought that field. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl merchant who's looking for the best possible pearls. The kingdom of heaven is like the woman who put yeast in a lump of dough, and pretty soon the whole lump was fermented. Well, it has this. The kingdom of heaven, Matthew 13, 24 and 25, the Ream says, the kingdom of heaven is resembled to a man that sowed good seed in his field. Very clear in this passage. But when men were asleep, his enemy came and oversowed cockle among the wheat. What do all other English translations say? Thank you. I can't see you in the back, but somebody knows what they're talking about. Yeah, it's the parable of the wheat and the tares. Well, only the Catholic Bible has cockle, the Reims New Testament. And in Coriolanus, we nourish against our Senate the cockle of rebellion, insolence, and sedition. And so they say, see, Shakespeare was not only a Catholic, but he probably had a Reims New Testament in his possession. But that won't do, folks. That won't do. Do you know why? The word cockle occurs in Shakespeare's sources. You probably know that Holinshed's Chronicles are the source of most of Shakespeare's history plays. Plutarch's Lives of Famous Greeks and Romans is the source of Shakespeare's 3 Roman plays, Julius Caesar, Coriolanus, Antony, and Cleopatra. Well, in this case, the cockle of rebellion, Shakespeare is actually using North's translation of Plutarch's Lives. Coriolanus is one of the 3 Roman plays. And here's what you have in North. I say Shakespeare is not referring to Scripture in this passage. His source is North, which he follows closely. Here's what North says. Moreover, he said that they nourished against themselves the naughty seed and cockle of insolency and sedition. Shakespeare uses that whole phrase, which had been sowed and scattered abroad among the people. You see, now what is North? North is actually a very important translator of works from Italian and other languages into English. Plutarch, of course, wrote that book, The Lives of Famous Greeks and Romans. He would take a Greek life, like Alexander the Great, and he would take a great Roman, the equivalent, so Julius Caesar, and he would compare the two, because although he lived in Rome where the libraries were much better, he was loyal to his Greek heritage, and he wanted to show, don't let the Roman culture and the Roman greatness overshadow the greatness of Greece. And so he had 25 pairs of lives, 1 Greek and 1 Roman, which he compares to each other. Well, that's the famous Plutarch's Lives. It was translated into French by Amyot, A-M-Y-O-T, and North did not translate it directly from the Greek. He translated it from Amyot's French translation. And North has this. He says his Shakespeare source is North, which he follows closely. Moreover, North says, he said they nourished against themselves the naughty seed and cockle of insolency and rebellion. You see, and these people who make these claims have not consulted Shakespeare's sources. Why did it take me 23 years to do my book? If I simply went through the plays and picked out the biblical references and commented on them, you could do a play a month, a play in 6 weeks. But for every play that I did, looking for the references. I read every source that Shakespeare is known to have read, or even that crossed his mind, that he knew of, that he had studied in school, that to see if the original is in that source. And that's what took a great deal of time. And if a person doesn't do that, they often draw wrong conclusions like this one, that Shakespeare is using the Reims New Testament when he's actually simply following the North's translation. You see, the person who does this, Hugh Pope, published the book English Versions of the Bible, and on page 275 he says that, here's what he says, that this passage in Coriolanus is evidence of Shakespeare's use of the Reims New Testament. But if he had consulted Shakespeare's sources, he wouldn't come to that wrong conclusion. For example, Cockle was often used in Proverbs. For example, Tilly is the greatest work which says about the Proverbs that existed in the 16th and 17th centuries. Here's one of the Proverbs. Cockle and corn grow in the same field, wheat and the tares. In much corn is some cockle. It was a common thing. That doesn't mean it was from the Reims New Testament. In Chaucer, you have the word cockle. Chaucer, who died in 1400, he lived from about 1340 to 1400, the Canterbury Tales. In the epilogue of the Man of Law's Tale, the shipwreck warns the host, don't you allow that Lollard preacher to preach, because if he does, he would spring cockle in our clean corn. He might preach the truth, and they didn't want that. Okay. And there were many others. The Geneva has cockle in Job 31:40. Let thistles grow instead of wheat and cockle instead of barley, and so forth. But we can go into a long background of that. Now, what was Shakespeare's religion then? Shakespeare, without any doubt, was a conforming Anglican. Shakespeare was born in the Anglican Church. He was baptized. He was married in the Anglican Church. His children were all baptized in the Anglican Church, and he died in the Anglican Church. Shakespeare was a conforming Anglican. In Holy Trinity Church in Stratford, behind the rail, there are about 8 graves. 4 of them, Shakespeare is buried in one of them, behind the rail in the church. And 3 of his relatives are in the other 4. Now, they say Shakespeare must have made a huge contribution to have that honor, but obviously he was a conforming Anglican that he is buried there. So to say that he was a secret Catholic and owned the Ream New Testament just won't do. Look, Carter, who published a work on Shakespeare's biblical references in 1903, tells you that Shakespeare was a Puritan. And so everybody wants to claim Shakespeare. Everybody wants to claim Shakespeare. Okay, now, you know what? If one of these quartos came on the market, which it wouldn't do, one of Shakespeare's, quartos of Shakespeare's day published in his time, it wouldn't, there are none left, they're all in libraries and museums. It would sell for $500,000 or more. In Shakespeare's time, these works were the Signet editions and the Pelican editions of the day. They were not, they were simply the cheap paperbacks of our day today. But because it's Shakespeare, of course, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark, who's there? Nay, answer me, stand and unfold yourself, long live the king, and so forth. But the greatest collection of them, you know what the Folger Library is? Folger seems to have been a relative of the Folger Coffee Company. That was one of the buildings that was built during the Depression in order to create work. And it is the greatest Shakespeare library in the world. Just like Rockefeller Center was also built during the Depression. They bought several square blocks in Manhattan, they tore them down, and they built Rockefeller Center with those huge skyscrapers. Well, it provided work for maybe 20,000 people for 5 or 10 years. And so that's the story with the Folger Shakespeare Library. He contributed that money in Washington, D.C., and it today is the greatest Shakespeare library there is, and it provided work in its day during a depression. You know, there are many other misconceptions that about Shakespeare and the Bible. For example, I've published 41 articles on this subject, Shakespeare and the various Bibles. Shakespeare and the Authorized Version, Shakespeare and the Bishop's Bible, Shakespeare and this Bible, and so forth. They tell you that the Geneva Bible, when it came out first, was the first Bible to be published in Roman letters. And most of them say that the Geneva Bible was published in Roman letter, not black letter. Black letter is the type that tries to imitate writing with a quill. When you put the quill on paper, the letter is narrow. As you begin making the letter, the quill broadens, and then as you're at the end of the letter, it becomes narrow again. It tries to imitate writing with a quill. Well, I wrote an article, some common misconceptions about the Geneva Bible, and I showed that if you count them very carefully, say in the short title catalog or in Darlow and Moore's catalog of English Bibles, there actually were more Bibles published in black letter than there were in Roman letter. It's true that the first edition published in Geneva in 1560 was in Roman letter. The second edition published in 1562 in Geneva. They didn't dare publish it in England because they wouldn't allow it. But there were more Bibles published in black letter than in Geneva, a little more than half. Why? Because they felt that that black letter was more stately and more impressive for a work as holy as the Bible should be. It's okay to take something like a Penguin paperback and publish it in Roman letter, but something like the Bible or very important classical work should be published in black letter. Holinshed's Chronicles are published in black letter, and so forth. Today, most people do not recognize most of Shakespeare's biblical references, but in Shakespeare's day, people were much more acquainted with the Bible. And the Bible was read extensively in the Anglican Church. You know, if you go to any Anglican church today, you have a first lesson, a reading from the Old Testament, a second lesson, a reading from the New Testament. In Shakespeare's day, if you attended church every day of the year, you would have read the New Testament 3 times and the Old Testament once. You would have heard the New Testament read 3 times and the Old Testament once. But you didn't have to go every day of the year. Some people did. In the case of Shakespeare, everybody had to attend every Sunday and every holy day. And you can imagine what work it was when I had to figure out what were the holy days and what Shakespeare heard. For example, it was consecutive Bible reading from Genesis onward, or for the second lesson from Matthew onward, but there were proper lessons. You don't read the next lesson in order on a certain holiday. If it's Easter, you drop that consecutive reading and you pick out a passage from one of the Gospels about the resurrection of Christ. If it's Christmas, Holy Day, you pick out an appropriate lesson. That's called a proper lesson about the birth of Christ. And so that also had to be dealt with. I would like to say that there's only once in all of Shakespeare that Shakespeare mentions a book of the Bible. As many references as he has, only once does he mention from what book of the Bible it is. In Henry V, Act 1, Scene 2, line 98, it says, "For in the book of Numbers it is writ, when the man dies, let his inheritance descend unto his daughter." That's taken from Numbers 27:8. "Thou shalt speak to the children of Israel, saying, If a man die and have no son, then shall ye turn his inheritance unto his daughter." And that's the only time Shakespeare reveals the name of a book in all of his plays. He does not add the words "without a son." he has to get that iambic pentameter line, 10 syllables. So when the man dies, let the inheritance. If he put without a son, it would break the rhythm. But why does he do that? It's because that's the way it was in the original, in Holinshed, his source. People have got to consult the sources. Holinshed has this. The archbishop further alleged out of the book of Numbers this saying, when a man dieth without a son, let the inheritance descend to his daughter. And so you see, we have to consult the sources to find out what Shakespeare does. But just to show you, this is a Xerox of a page in my book, to show you how frequent Shakespeare's biblical references are, that book of Numbers is 1298. 1297 is the sin upon my head. That is a very frequent biblical, I have a variation of the frequent biblical expression that if one sins, his blood shall be upon his head, Joshua 2:19. And I list dozens of other scriptures. Right after it, in 12109, you have lion's whelp. Does anyone know where that's from? Louder? Exactly. Jacob's deathbed blessing on his 12 sons. Judah is a lion's whelp. And you see, that's how frequent and Shakespeare's biblical references are. Now, how did Shakespeare get his knowledge of the Bible? I mentioned the reading of the Old and the New Testaments and how much you would have heard if you attended a Holy Year. And we mentioned the proper lessons and so forth. However, there were certain lessons that were not read in the first. There were certain portions of scriptures that were not read in the first lesson Old Testament and the second lesson New Testament because it said these are not edifying and they should not be read in church. There were certain passages from Ezekiel, for example, and from Revelation. Yet in Antony and Cleopatra, Shakespeare quotes passages from Revelation that were those lessons that were, those passages that were excluded from the list of readings. So obviously he did his great, he did a lot of reading on the side, and he read the Bible a great deal. You know, before he wrote any play, he did extremely wide reading. Antony and Cleopatra takes place in Egypt. He read the book of Exodus. He read everything he could about Egypt, and about Revelation, and he uses that those references. But it was worth it, folks. Now, I'd like to tell you this. After me tooting so much, my horn so much about my book, how many copies of my book do you think were printed? A famous press, the University of Delaware. How many copies do you think were printed? If I told you already, don't speak up. You see, I was on the airplane today, and I mentioned that to a woman sitting beside me. She was just graduating from Georgia Tech with a degree in civil engineering. I said, good for you. She said 50,000. Are you kidding? Even when Harvard, Yale, and Princeton published books, the average academic book is published in an edition of about 1,000 or 1,200. These are not novels. Well, Delaware published, after I told you how great my book was, 800 copies. That's all? I objected. I said even my Spencer book was published in an edition of 1,000, and Shakespeare is more important than Spencer. Here's what they told me. They said, listen, we consider 800 to be a very good press run for such a specialized book. We cover our costs at $750, and if it goes out of print, we'll reprint it. Okay, well, to my great surprise and happiness, it went out of print in 15 months. I asked them to reprint it. They said, no, we can't reprint it. Why? We have to see how the orders accumulate. Exact words, how the orders accumulate. How many orders do you have? 80. That's not enough? No. You see, the acquisition budgets in libraries are down in the pit. They have no money to buy books. Well, they finally did publish it 3 years later. They printed 300 copies. And I said to the director, I said, Julian, listen, I'll make a deal with you. Publish 350. And if at the end of a year those extra 50 don't sell, I'll buy 25 of them if you'll give them to me at half price. $30. The book is, you see, the first edition was $49.95, $50. He said, we can't do that anymore. The second printing is going to have to be $60. But that is very cheap for a book 880 pages with original spellings of the Geneva Bible and all the Bibles and of Shakespeare's text. You can buy a book of 180 pages from one of the great presses, and it alone will be $50, $60, $70. You have no idea. And if the book is published by Oxford and Cambridge, because the pound is so high, books from Oxford and Cambridge often cost $100 to $120. And so 1 year later, he writes me, he said, you agreed to buy 25 of the books if they didn't sell in 1 year. And we're going to ship them to you. I was glad to get them because they have now about 120 or 130 copies left. They will sell out, and then I will have some to fill orders with. Okay, I'm actually going a little overtime, am I? Yeah, and I do want to leave time for questions, but I'll tell you something else. Oh, you got a lot of royalties, didn't you? No, no, no. Let me tell you. The contract said the author will get 10% of the retail price after the first 800 copies are sold. But they only printed 800. You see, it's because there's so much competition to publish and to get published on a good university press. You can get published on other presses that are not very good. But listen, I might conclude by saying this, that I was very selective in choosing the references in my book. I wanted to make sure that that is actually a reference, not simply a religious image. I wanted to make sure it was a reference and not simply a similar situation. I wanted to make sure it was a reference and not something imaginary, not simply a parallel structure, and so forth. Well, thank you for your kind attention, and if anyone has any question, if there's time for it, I know I'm about 10 minutes over time, over 1 hour, I'd be happy to answer your questions for you.